Happy New Year's Eve, and it's time for a 2024 retrospective for Marvel Snap. I'll be counting down the 10 most broken cards Marvel Snap released in 2024. Number 10, Thena, who released as a 2-1 and was nerfed to a 2-0 later. Thena was a major boost to Kitty Pryde style decks and was a major part of those decks as they took a victory lap around the metagame, as swiftly after Thena came Cannonball, so we had these massive Cannonball Thena Professor X decks, along with Ravonna Renslayer, that were unbelievably powerful. Since then, Thena has, I won't say languished, but she hasn't reached the heights that she reached as a 2-1 in that shell. As a 2-0, she obviously isn't taking priority. Red Guardian has become much more popular and is very, very good against a 2-0, especially a 2-0 that is played with Kitty Pryde so often. This is a card that has very defined strengths and weaknesses, and I think the fact that it only had to get nerfed to 2-0 to become a relatively balanced but still good card is indicative that it was roughly in the ballpark of where they want a good card to be when it comes out. It's just that the shell that it went in was already one of the best things to be doing, and Thena was a massive boost to that. As the game sort of matured towards the end of the year, there ended up being a lot more competition to stuff like this. We've had full metagames without Thena being a major part of them. She's always been around, but she has rarely been a part of the best deck at any given time. And I think that means that she's a safe choice for number 10 on this list, even though I think people may remember her as a much stronger card than she actually was, due to the context of her release. At number 9, we have Surtur. Surtur is a very powerful card still, but it's another +3 scaler that needed to be nerfed by 1 point of power. The reason I'm putting Surtur up here is because Surtur also sort of necessitated the nerf to Scar, and arguably also the nerf to Typhoid Mary, meaning that Surtur, even at 3-4, was still good enough to get other cards nerfed. It just wasn't the kind of card that could get nerfed reasonably on its own anymore. And I think a lot of that is because it's very difficult to design a card that goes in the 10s deck. If you want to nerf it to a real degree, you end up taking it out of the 10s deck. For example, if Surtur went to +3, it would no longer be discounting Scar after you played 2 10s, which is almost the entire point of the card. A 3-3 going to a 3-6 going to a 3-9 doesn't get you to that breakpoint of 10. By the same token, getting Typhoid Mary nerfed, I mean, what else were they supposed to do? Are they supposed to nerf one of the 4-10s out of the deck, make it a 4-9? You have to do something along the reasonable lines in order to make this deck weaker, but there's not a lot of nerfs you can possibly make that don't absolutely destroy one of the card slots in the deck, which is a bad move. Surtur, I think, ends up a little bit higher than Thena because of this, because of its ability to get other stuff nerfed, but I do think that it is worth pointing out that this is also one of, if not the fastest nerfs any card has ever received. They released Surtur, they saw how good it was, and they were like, whoa, we have to dial this back. It's a testament to the power of Surtur that it still remains a functional and good card to this day. Even though it is limited in terms of the decks it can go in, it really only goes in one at this point, and that is its deck. 3-5 Nocturne, I might get a little bit of heat for putting at number 8 ahead of both Thena and Surtur. Thena and Surtur are these very standalone big cards that are very often the reason why you lost a game. So I think a lot of people look at them and they see very obviously those are the problems. Those are the reasons why I lost, rather than something like Nocturne, who was just generally better than whatever it was I was doing. To me, I think that general advantage matters more. Yes, Surtur and Thena are extremely powerful when they work. Nocturne was extremely powerful all the time. It didn't matter if you drew it late. It didn't matter if you drew it early. When Nocturne was released, there wasn't nearly as many competitors for good 3-drops as there are now. And even now, I think a 3-5 Nocturne might be better than those. Rocket and Groot released today. We'll see how that ends up looking. This is a card that has excellent stats, or had excellent stats. And the reason it totally disappeared after the nerf is because it was premised on those stats. The reason you'd run Nocturne is because at a 3-5, it was simply better than every other 3. A 3-5 that could move, a 3-5 that had location control on it. That value proposition was unmatched by any other 3-cost in the game, barring perhaps Red Guardian. This is a phenomenally powerful card that was a consistent performer across a wide variety of archetypes, and that is why I put it over Thena and Surtur in terms of broken, because this card ate so much more real estate than those cards did. You had to build around those cards to make them work. Nocturne simply went in everything and was amazing. When it lost that point of power, we have now what I would describe as a bit of a power vacuum at the 3 spot with a lot of different contenders, and that's a better metagame for everyone and a more enjoyable situation to be in. I think this was a good nerf, but I also understand why they went for what they went for. Nocturne's 3/5 stat line is a nod to her parentage. She is the alternate universe child of Scarlet Witch and Nightcrawler, and her stats and abilities were a combination of what Scarlet Witch and Nightcrawler do in Marvel Snap. It was a good swing, but she was just a little too good as a generic 3/5 with massive upside. Red Hulk has special distinction as a card that had to get nerfed twice before it ended up in a functional and reasonable spot. I think it's possible I actually have him a little bit too high on this list, and maybe he should be a little lower, but you'll understand why I made the decisions that I did. I think once we get to those cards that are above Red Hulk, he is coming in here has a very reasonable number 7, which I think, take it or leave it. I don't really think that there's necessarily a good argument for him coming in much lower than that, but there could be. I mean, this card was fundamentally just a really big 6 in a metagame that really liked having a really big 6. It was a full confluence of all the things that were really good about this card being also what the metagame it released into was about. This was a card that went in Thanos decks. This was a card that went in decks that played Professor X. This was a card that went in decks that played Dr. Octopus. This was a card that was the biggest 6-drop around. And because it was the biggest 6-drop around, it was very often paired with ways to win a lane on turn 5. Because if you have the biggest 6-drop around, winning a lane on turn 5 is really good. Your 6-drop is bigger than theirs, you're going to win. Red Hulk at this level got up to 19, 20 points fairly often. That felt like, honestly, what the average was. This is a very, very reasonable card at the current rate of 610 and +3. So you can imagine how much better it was at 611 and +4. Now, the context has changed for this card. There are other 6-drops that can approach that size, like Gore the God Butcher, although they do it with less regularity. There is a much lower ceiling on the card now. There's more ways to cheat out various amounts of power. This card is more reasonable in the world that we are in now, with less ways to win the game on turn 5 than it was when it released. But I still think these numbers would probably be a little bit much. Red Hulk is a perfectly fine card now. It is no longer the cream of the crop of 6-drops. There's far more competition now, but I think if it released again at 611 +4, it would probably be the cream of the crop of 6-drops once again. Number 6, Cannonball. And I think Cannonball is one of the reasons why Red Hulk ends up at number 7, because when I think of that era of Marvel Snap, yes, Red Hulk was big and important, but nothing felt so awful as the combination of Professor X into Cannonball. It was a kind of combo that a tempo deck could run. We talked about this deck a little bit when discussing Thena already. This tempo Prof X Cannonball deck was just borderline unbeatable. There were so many things that it did that were so completely unfair, even in the world where it wasn't having this full lockdown combo of Prof X Cannonball. It was stacking up massive points with Thena and various other cards. I personally believe that this is not necessarily a testament to how good Cannonball is, but rather a testament to Professor X, as of course this combination disappeared after the rework of Professor X. That makes ranking Cannonball a little bit difficult, so I have decided to put all of the onus for that deck, or the onus for the card or the combination, on the new card, i.e., I'm grading Cannonball here as it was on release in the Prof X Cannonball combo. That is not to say that it is still amazing. It's still like a fine to okay card that you're not going to be upset to have, but it's definitely a far cry from what it was when it had a 1-card combo that basically won the game. Cannonball really hasn't been changed. The context around him has. And I think this is a valuable lesson in how contextual power can be. Yes, it only lost 1 card, and that card didn't even disappear, it just stopped working with Cannonball. but that's enough to make Cannonball go from one of the most broken cards to ever release to fine, I guess? Technically, the text on White Widow is the same as it was when she released, but I think this card was just a fundamental mistake from the developers of Marvel Snap. Of all the mistakes we're going to talk about, this is the one that I have the least sympathy for and the most animus for as a design entirely. I personally think that Clog should come with a reasonable downside, and I think most Clog cards were designed as such. Titania, for example, has a reasonable downside. Green Goblin and Hobgoblin. What if your opponent fills that lane up and they stick on your side? There's a real downside there. This card was basically a 2-energy Green Goblin that at worst put a rock on your opponent's side of the board and at best had 6 power with no actual downside built in. And you'll notice that as soon as they put that downside into the card, i.e. allowing the Widow's Bite or putting the text on the Widow's Bite that says when this lane gets full, Widow's Bite goes away, it ended up being a kind of unplayable card. This card was premised on being Clog without the downside, and I think that's a bad premise to start from. I am not a believer that this card ever should have been what it was, but what it was ultimately effectively one of the best on-curve 2-drops just on stats at basically 2/6 unless they filled the lane up, and then also a free Clog card that made the game worse. And the reason I'm so heinously biased against Clog cards is because I don't think they are a fun way of playing Marvel Snap, and frankly, I don't think the devs do either, which is what makes things so awkward. I think it's fine to have Clog cards around. They can serve a valuable role in metagames, like ones that are dominated by turn 6 combo decks. Clog stuff can really mess that up, and it's a valuable counterweight to that kind of gameplay. However, this is too free. You can't just have Clog be a major part of the game because you gave Clog a 2/6 with no downside. And I think this is ultimately the card that over the entire year I get the most upset at personally. On to number 4, and this card, spoiler alert, is the only one of the top 4 that still exists in the game. Madam Web fundamentally breaks what Move is premised on. Every Move payoff card that is reasonably played, that is to say Human Torch, that is to say Dagger, that is to say Vulture, is premised on the idea that you have to use another card to make that card move. And furthermore, there aren't very many cards, if any, that will give you multiple moves. Heimdall being the only one at the time this card came out. Heimdall, of course, will not give you multiple moves on the same card either. This, on the other hand, represents effectively 3 banked moves when you play it on turn 2. You get a move on turn 3, turn 4, and turn 5, and maybe even another one on turn 6, depending on how you've set it up. Most of the time it ends up being 3 banked moves because you aren't going to have that Human Torch into Madam Web opening, or because you'll have better things to do with that Human Torch, such as pulling it back into the lane later with a Ghost Spider. But it can represent up to 4 banked moves in the ultimate nut draw situations. This card is simply breaking what Move is premised on. And when you look at every Move card, and you look at the ease with which Madam Web allows them to move, it's hard not to look at a card like Dagger and say, how is that the reward for moving 1 time? How is 6 power on a Vulture the reward for moving 1 time? That doesn't sound right at all. And the reason it doesn't sound right is because of this card. If every Move card still required a whole other card to be used to get that trigger, I think the deck would not be nearly as annoying and oppressive as it is now. But between this card, Madam Web, and the fact that bounce cards let you reuse those whole other cards that you've already used, like Ghost Spider and like Iron Fist, suddenly the Move deck, especially the Move bounce deck, can hit massive point output in a non-interactive way. There's a lot of points coming on the final turn of the game. You have no idea where they're going to go, and you don't even really have the ability to use tech cards against a lot of them. Madam Web is a problem, and the only one of the top 4 that is still in the game in her current form. Number 3, Mockingbird. Mockingbird at 5'9", and also at 6'10", actually. After her first nerf, she was still very, very good. But Mockingbird at 5'9" was the lifeline that kept Thanos afloat back in the early months of 2024. And by early months, I mean like, April, May-ish, as I recall. I'm not sure I have my time right. Honestly, ever since the pandemic, my internal clock has been entirely wrong. But I remember pitching this card just have some text that say does not work with Thanos stones, because at the time Thanos was very, very good, and this was the card that was released into an already good Thanos world and sort of kept it afloat through multiple nerfs and reworks, right? Thanos now not really a major player, but Mockingbird still is, even at her current 6'9" spot. She's being played in various Mysterio Gwenpool type decks. She's being played in every Arishem deck, and of course Arishem Thanos, and even normal Thanos, which is sort of back-ish. People are playing it. This is a card that is fundamentally a problem, and I also think that looking ahead to the January season, you can see a card like Victoria Hand, and you can see the ways in which they were like, we can't make the same mistake as we did with Mockingbird here. Mockingbird is a shield card that was pretty clearly designed to go with shield cards like Agent Coulson and things like that. What ended up happening was she was very explicitly only being played in Thanos and Arishem, no synergy at all with what she was meant to be doing. And of course, you look ahead to Victoria Hand, a shield card or a hammer card, as it were, depending on, how much of a comic nerd you want me to be, that explicitly doesn't work with cards that are generated in the deck like Thanos Stones and Arishem cards. And I think that is a meaningful lesson that was learned from Mockingbird. Obviously, I don't really have any insight into why they made that decision, but when I look at Mockingbird and what I learned from it, and then I look at Victoria Hand, I see what I learned from it reflected in Victoria Hand, although in a much, much more elegant way. It definitely is much better designed to look at Victoria Hand and be like, oh, I get it. It doesn't work with Thanos and Arishem. It really wants to work with the shield cards. Oh, that makes sense. That makes perfect sense. But it also doesn't do the hack thing that I suggested of saying, this doesn't work with Thanos and Arishem, and then just putting that on the card. It's much better to design it in a sort of more narrow way, but not tell the players, hey, you can't do this. And I think that is a really good lesson to learn, frankly. I view that as an upgrade in terms of how they think about cards like this, and I think they have a better understanding of like what it means to make a shield card now in a world where Thanos and Arishem exist. I agonized over the order of 2 and 1, and I think honestly that in my heart of hearts, I think this card was stronger at its peak than Arishem was. Spoiler alert for number 1. But this is a very strong, unbelievably powerful card, and frankly, the only card I would say that legitimately broke Marvel Snap in 2024. I think a lot of people argue that for Arishem, but when you get down to it, what Agent Venom was doing was basically being a 220. You'd play it, you'd get multiplications on your Iron Man, on your Mystique, even your friggin' Cosmo got bigger. You'd get multiplications on your Thena, on your Sage, on everything in this deck. And the only reason that I'm not putting it on its own higher up is because it's basically the same deck as the Cannonball Prophex deck. It's just that deck had its Cannonball Prophex combo, and this deck had 10 million points. I do think that Agent Venom on release was probably the strongest I've seen in terms of once people figured out that Iron Man deck, shout out to Yo Woody, I didn't feel like it was ever anything but the best deck to play. And that is rare. And that was just consistent week to week to week to week to week. It was that. Agent Venom got nerfed. That deck doesn't necessarily disappear, but people find different ways to repurpose it. I personally believe that this is the card that was the most off in terms of numbers in the entirety of Marvel Snap 2024, but its impact was muted because it simply wasn't ever as popular as the card we're going to talk about at number 1. I don't think anyone other than me would have really agonized about putting Arishem at the top of this list. I think that a lot of what made him broken was context, though, and a lot of people, I think, have the sort of order backwards on how they ended up dealing with the cards that were really broken in Arishem. To my mind, actually, Arishem was kind of a massive smashing success, and I'll run you through why. Okay, so first of all, I am fairly sure this is the most popular card they've ever released. People play the crap out of this card. Oh, it seems like almost everyone owns it, honestly, based on the feedback I got when it got nerfed. And I also think that having a card that is this popular and is this unique is basically objectively a good thing. When you look at what those Arishem decks were doing, right? When you look at what they were abusing, the cards they were abusing, Leech, Doc Ock, and Loki, stuff like that, right? If you take a step back and zoom out for a second and say, you know, I'm a second dinner designer. I've designed the most popular card ever, and it gave me an excuse to nerf Leech, Doc Ock, and Loki, 3 cards that literally everybody hates. I kind of think you can't call that anything but a win. Like, I kind of think that that would be the biggest win of the year, frankly. Maybe the biggest win of the entire lifespan of Marvel Snap is getting this card. It's extremely popular. You get to nerf all the stuff that you, as a designer, are like, wow, this really conflicts with my vision of what the game is. I can't really say anything other than that it is a success. These archetype invalidating cards, like Doc Ock, like Loki, like Leech, all are now in better spots. This card itself is now in a better spot. I personally think that while Arishem was extremely powerful and popular, I also think that they've gotten it to a point where it's like, I'm not really mad about that. I also, furthermore, think that there is like a degree of what I would almost describe as Arishem derangement syndrome, where people just don't want to experience this card at all. I've seen very good players just say stuff like, I can't believe I'm still playing against this deck. I hate it so much. And it's like, I don't really understand why. Because to me, Arishem right now, you're playing against a sort of amorphous blob, but that amorphous blob typically looks about the same as it would do normally, right? It has a shape to it, but the specifics are undefined, which means that as long as you play against that shape, you're mostly going to be okay. I think at a certain point, certain people just got too sick of the randomness of the card, and they just have no tolerance for that in their game. And I guess I perhaps have a higher tolerance for randomness, or a greater, I guess, love of it. Like, for example, here's the thing that would make me weird. I think Magic's mana system is genius, and everyone who tries to fix it is usually wrong. Like, this is something that is unique to me, that I have such a high tolerance for this kind of stuff. But it's hard for me to look at Arishem and say this was a failure of a card. I think it probably sold really well. I think it probably was very popular. I think it probably still is very popular. I think it's currently balanced, and I think it got 3 cards everyone hates into much better spots. I'm not saying they needed to destroy Leech, Arishem, and Loki, but I think they moved them into better spots. These cards are better for the game where they are now. And if you lay that at the feet of Arishem, I can't call that anything but a good thing. All right, y'all, that was my picks for the top 10 most broken cards in 2024 in Marvel Snap. Let me know what you think in the comments. You think I missed anything? You think my analysis was wrong? You think my order was wrong? Let me know. I will read them as always. I have been KM Best. You have been phenomenal. I will see you in the next one.